Well, good afternoon, everyone. To those joining us for this discussion session this afternoon, I'm Chris Graydon, Member of Parliament for Epsom and Newell in the UK. And this is a discussion this afternoon about the UK's new Environment Bill, which is reaching the House of Commons, the full House of Commons, for debate tomorrow afternoon. It's a two-day debate. The second day will be shortly. And then this will pass off to the House of Lords and then into law, hopefully, and is one of the biggest measures of its kind the UK has ever done, an indication of how high a priority environmental issues are now here. What we have this afternoon is a panel of people with a particular perspective on one of the key issues in the bill, and one of the issues that is very important to me personally, which is the whole issue of forest protection. You know, we are in a position where forest habitat around the world is being destroyed as we speak, and with it goes the habitat of a huge number of endangered species, with implications for the climate, but just in overall terms, implications for the environmental balance across the planet. There are clearly issues within the United Kingdom, though we're fortunate in having more trees now in the country than we have for probably 100 years or more. But nonetheless, there are still bold ambitions to expand forestry still further. That's good, but we also have to, in the way we interact internationally, in the way the goods we all buy, the businesses we all do business with, have to make the whole issue of forest protection much more of a central part of what we do in future. This bill will, I hope, play a part in that. But what we have this afternoon is a group of people with a particular perspective on the issue of forestry and how we make sure that what we buy is coming from sustainable sources that don't just destroy habitats around the world. So we'll be hearing from Anna Turrell, who's Head of Environment at Tesco, from Raul Silva Teles de Valle, who is the Director of Socio-Environmental Law and Justice at WWF Brazil, particular perspective on these issues. From Debbie Tripley, who is Director of Environmental Policy and Advocacy at the WWF in the UK. From Jeff Mulder, Director of Global Programs at the Rainforest Alliance. And then finally, we have Nick Lakin from Kingfisher. So I'm going to ask each of them to give some introductory remarks on the issue. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion. So Anna, I'm going to throw it over to you first. One of the things we have to get right, and indeed one of the things I've brought forward a private member's bill in UK Parliament, which won't make it into law, but hopefully will set a direction. We have to get consumers buying from more sustainable sources. Tesco is very much at the front line of consumer interaction with food products in the UK. So talk to us a bit about how you and your company hope that you can actually drive sustainability through your supply chain.
Fantastic. Many thanks. And let me just start by really kind of extending a big welcome to this Environment Bill, and also just to encourage all MPs to do attend the report stage debate, because I think it's such a critical issue. And as Chris has nicely teed up in the introductory remarks there, you know, it's one that as a consumer-facing company is something that's really close to our heart, and we spend a lot of time and effort kind of working on. So let me just spend a couple of minutes maybe explaining the Tesco perspective on this. As a company, we are committed to achieving zero net deforestation in the sourcing of palm oil, soy, wood and paper for our own brand products. We also endorse the New York Declaration on Forests. And actually, even if we go back to 2010, which feels a long time ago now, we committed to achieving zero net deforestation by the end of last year through certification and other practices. But pleased to be able to deliver on that commitment before the deadline. Our approach to delivering on our commitments and to broader environmental sustainability starts with transparency. It starts with setting clear targets, mapping our footprint, and tracking our progress against those targets. Mapping our footprint includes knowing the countries of origin and the companies which trade or import the commodity in our markets. Only through this visibility are we able to really help kind of deliver on and achieve our zero deforestation objectives at both geographic and industry level. In 2019, we became the first and remain the only retailer to be transparent in our soy supply chain in terms of traders and country of origin by publishing our supply chain mapping. Food retailers such as Tesco occupy quite a distinct place in the food value chain compared to food manufacturers and FMCG companies. Because of the volume and the diversity of the products sold in retail, it's very challenging to have significant visibility or engagement further upstream in agricultural supply chains compared with manufacturers who tend to have more integrated supply chains. So they have that visibility, that proximity to the supply chain. In recognition of the complexity of the challenges that we face in delivering supply chain transparency, but yet the fact that it's so fundamental to delivering on our commitments, last year we led the creation of the Soy Transparency Coalition. The STC is a pre-competitive group of retailers and manufacturers that engage, assess and rank the soy traders on their performance on zero deforestation for all soy they grade globally. As a member of the STC, we've committed to take action on the annual assessment results. But that consistency in engagement in the upstream agricultural supply chain, and specifically with those commodity traders, is absolutely vital and imperative for us to be able to get the information we need in order to make the decisions we need on the sourcing of our commodities. In addition to that, in order to deliver on our commitment to zero net deforestation, we've got supplier requirements in place for all direct suppliers. And these requirements correspond with the most material forest risk commodities in our supply chain, which I've mentioned already: soy, palm oil, and timber. Soy represents Tesco's largest forest risk commodity footprint. And as such, a couple of years ago in 2018, we set an additional target to ensure that not only in our is our soy zero deforestation, but that it comes from whole areas and regions that are verified as deforestation free. So this really represented a strengthening of our ambitions and commitment in line with expert advice on really what the most effective approach would be in order to secure a deforestation-free supply. In addition to that, we also took the step of removing the sale of Brazilian beef from our stores in 2018 due to deforestation concerns. So you can see there's kind of a ratcheting up of our corporate ambitions and activities in line with the kind of the scale of the challenge, but also the expectation on us as a company. In addition to our corporate commitments and supplier requirements, we are strongly engaged in various industry initiatives, including the Consumer Goods Forum, Forest Positive Coalition of Action, Palm Oil Transparency Coalition, Soy Transparency Coalition, which I've mentioned, the Retail Palm Oil Group, the Retail Soy Group, and the UK Roundtables on Sustainable Palm Oil and Sustainable Soy. I list them just to give you a sense and a flavour of just the number and volume of these forums that we are engaging in. And it somewhat in kind of correlation with the scale of the challenge that we all face, but the need in order to, and recognition that we need to make the changes. Just final thoughts, coming back to the due diligence legislation that is being discussed. We really believe that the scope of any legislation should follow a risk-based approach. So companies first placing commodities or products onto the UK market should assess the risk of having commodities or products in their supply chain that are linked to deforestation or ecosystem conversion, as well as human rights abuse, and take measures to ensure that their risk is reduced to a minimum or a negligible level. Really important to take a risk-based approach. And then the second point that I think is really important, in a similar way to Tesco ratcheting up its ambitions and its action to tackle deforestation, so does any legislation that we bring in need to have the capacity to strengthen over time if we are to tackle what is such a systemic global issue. Certainly from our experience, there is no single solution, no one size fits all. This stuff is difficult, it's complex, and so we need the space to be able to make those strengthened commitments and then flow that through the supply chain accordingly. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute, Chris.
That's better. I have to remember to unmute myself. Anna, thank you. Very interesting. And it's good to see a company like Tesco taking as much care over these issues as you clearly are. In case anybody wonders why there's a big orange hedgehog behind me, well, the orange background anyway, it's because I'm parliamentary species champion of the hedgehog, and increasing the protection of hedgehogs is one part of the debate coming up on the bill. But enough hedgehogs, back to the rest of the bill, the forestry. And I'm going to pass over now to Debbie Tripley from the WWF to give us her perspective on the bill, and indeed the particular parts of the bill we're talking about this afternoon related to forest protection. Debbie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks also to Anna, who really expressed well, I think, why we need legislation in the Environment Bill. And I'd like to specifically address that piece of legislation, which I think is so important and also reflects why we need to go beyond voluntary measures, why we need to have some mandatory measures as set out in the Environment Bill. But I also want to also say a little bit about why I think the government needs to do a bit more than what they've put actually in the Environment Bill by way of an amendment. And the first thing I want to say is it's really important for MPs to turn up and vote on this piece of legislation that's in the Environment Bill. I personally see it as one of the probably the most important environmental pieces of legislation to future-proof us over the coming decade. But we do need legislation that is of its time, and this piece of legislation, I would say, is world-leading. It requires companies to stop deforestation in their supply chains, which, as we all know, is something we need to do quite urgently. It's also right, I think, that the UK takes the lead on this, especially as it takes up the presidency of the Climate COP in Glasgow. I think the best way to understand the due diligence legislation that's in the Environment Bill is really by seeing the links between the causes of zoonotic diseases, the pandemic, the destruction of nature and climate change. Globally, our consumption is a key driver of climate change and also a cause of nature's degradation. And we showed in WWF's Riskier Business 2 report quite clearly that between 2016 and 2018, just a 2-year period, the UK used the equivalent of 88% of the UK land area to supply just 7 key commodities to the UK market, such as soy and palm oil. We also know that action for the Amazon is urgent, and Raoul will speak a bit more on that in a minute. But deforestation is not slowing. WWF's latest Deforestation Fronts report, just out in January, shows that across key global hotspots, we lost forest totaling 43 million hectares. That's nearly twice the size of the UK, and just in 13 years. So whilst the government has listened to needing urgent legislation on due diligence, we also need, I think, laws to be effective. And here WWF believes the current proposal falls short. The new law requires compliance with the in-country laws, but critically, it fails to build in any sustainability criteria. And this throws up many problems. One example is in-country governance. For instance, in places like Brazil, as it's well known, the forest code is not widely enforced. And that's problematic if you build a law that relies on enforcement of local laws. And it already allows in Brazil, legally, further permits up to 88 million hectares of forest to be destroyed. This law will not address sustainability in relation to forest conversion. It is also constantly being undermined, the forest code, by the current government, with a recent amnesty for violations removing legal protection from an area of approximately 41 million hectares, almost twice the size of the UK. So our fear is that the law will encourage a race to the bottom, not to the top. And I'm sorry, it's sorry to have to say that, because overall we commend the government for bringing forward actually such world-leading legislation. But as I say, we do need it to be effective. I think we feel that we want the government to take further steps to strengthen what they've started. Just as Anna said, we need to see a ratcheting of what has been put in place. And we think that can be done in a couple of ways. It could be strengthened by having a target for achieving a zero deforestation by 2023. If the government was to put into place in the Environment Bill a target that ratcheted up from legality only to zero deforestation, that would send a very strong market signal, would allow the market time to get ready for such an approach. And in many ways, we think that's nothing different from the Climate Change Act, which aims to eliminate climate emissions by 2050. We also think that there needs to be a commitment of action in the finance sector, which is a critical sector and plays a critical part in relation to deforestation. And yet this amendment is silent in relation to the finance sector. And finally, we'd like to see in the bill a 2030 target for the UK's global footprint. Again, we see that as a ratcheting up to where we need to be in 2030 at the end of the decade, to looking at mitigating the UK's global footprint overall. And that could include many other sectors in relation, not just forest risk commodities, as this particular amendment is focused on. Just to end, I think it's worth reflecting too that there's clearly a lot of public concern on this issue. The response to the consultation for the due diligence amendment was one of the largest responses the government has had in recent times to a consultation. And for all of those reasons, I think that's why we think that it's really important to not only have this groundbreaking legislation, which we're pleased the government has put forward, but also to really get it right. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Debbie. Very helpful, very interesting. So now to get a perspective from one of the areas most badly affected by deforestation, which is Brazil, over to Raul, who is speaking to us from Sao Paulo province and is the WWF specialist on all of these issues in Brazil. So Raul, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Raul Vale. I am a Brazilian environmental lawyer. I currently work at the WWF Brazil, and I'm very pleased to be here and have the opportunity to present my perspective about the environmental bill, in particular about the due diligence clause and how it could help to prevent the expansion of deforestation over primary forests and savannas here in Brazil. First of all, it's important to say that Brazil is a major agriculture exporter but doesn't need to deforest to expand its agricultural production. We have an area larger than 3 UKs of poorly used pastureland. If we invest funds and technology already available, we can expand our agricultural production for the next 20 years with no need to cut any tree. This reality, Brazil keeps converting forests and savannas into agricultural lands at high rates, as the WWF Deforestation Front's report showed. Last year, we reached the highest numbers in more than a decade. Deforestation in the country happens because, for many reasons, it is still cheaper to open new land for agricultural use than to invest in the restoration of degraded pastureland. One of the reasons is lack of law enforcement. The due diligence clause is a way to enforce the law, so it's easy to imagine that it could help to reduce forest conversion. Right? Well, not exactly. As an environmental lawyer and activist, I witnessed what happened to the Brazilian Forest Code just 80 years ago. This history is a clue to what can happen if the due diligence clause is approved focusing only in the legality of deforestation as an indicator of good practice. For many decades, the Forest Code, that regulates forest conversion in private land, had no law enforcement at all. As we say here, we had a law that existed only in the books. But things changed when, beginning in the 90s, we started to strengthen the law enforcement with new legal and technological tools. As a result, it became more expensive not to comply with the law, as this could lead to fines. Companies started to ask to its suppliers if they were in compliance with the Forest Code in order to prevent financial problems. So what was the outcome? Did farmers adjust their production model in order to comply with law conservation standards? On the contrary, they pressured the parliament to change the law. In 2012, the Forest Code was replaced by a new legislation that granted amnesty to more than 3 million farmers, removing legal protection from an area twice the size of the United Kingdom. With this legal change, these 3 million farmers kept doing exactly what they were doing before, but now in accordance with the law. Unfortunately, this is not something that happened in the past, and will never happen again. On the contrary, the movement in the country to roll back the environmental legislation is big, and it's increasing. There are 56 bills in the National Congress that intend to modify, for the worse, the forest legislation. So, in short, battery. Our fear is that a due diligence clause that takes into consideration only the legality of the production, not its compliance with concrete and social environmental standards, could not only frustrate the goals of the environmental bill, but could also lead to a major setback in the environmental legislation in Brazil and other countries alike, as Indonesia. That's why we ask for improvement in this clause.
I think, has it gone frozen on everybody else's screens? Right. So Raoul, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think we've lost you momentarily. So I'm going to move on and ask Jeff to pick up next. And then Jeff, if he comes back on stream and interrupts, we'll kind of recompartmentalize you both. But if I can hand over to Jeff now, hopefully we'll get Raoul back in a moment.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much to the ICCF for this opportunity, Mr. Grayling. My name is Jeff Milder, and in addition to my role at the Rainforest Alliance, I'm here today representing the Accountability Framework Initiative, which is a coalition of 23 NGOs from around the world, including WWF, who are dedicated to ensuring that commodity supply chains are protective of forests, other ecosystems, and human rights. I'd like to speak briefly about the scope of the due diligence proposal to address the footprint of UK imports of forest risk commodities. The current Environment Bill draft seeks to address these challenges by instituting a due diligence requirement to avoid illegal deforestation in countries of origin. But as my colleagues have highlighted already, our concern is that practices that address only illegal deforestation are not sufficient to meet these goals. A legality-only approach would enable UK market demand to contribute to pressure for forest and ecosystem conversion within up to 110 million hectares of currently standing forests in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay alone. Legal conversion in the Brazilian Cerrado, which is one of the main fronts of soybean expansion, could emit more than 3 trillion tons of carbon dioxide, about 4 times the entire annual greenhouse gas footprint of the UK. So to meet policy goals related to biodiversity protection and climate change mitigation, a policy approach would need to address both illegal and legal deforestation and conversion. I'd like to speak about the practicality of such an approach. And what I'd like to emphasize is that in addition to being the approach that's most consistent with the stated policy goals, a no deforestation and no conversion approach is also practical and feasible for buyers of forest risk commodities. As a result of the work of our coalition members and other NGOs over the past several years, together with many companies and industry groups that were mentioned by my colleague from Tesco, among others, we now have clear standards, functional systems, and a growing body of experience implementing deforestation and conversion-free supply chains. There is a ready-made infrastructure of tools around risk assessment, monitoring, and reporting that would be available for UK businesses to implement a due diligence system around this approach. And there is also growing agreement, not only from civil society and the general public, but also from investors and from commodity buyers themselves, that supply chains should be free from deforestation and conversion in the countries of origin. For instance, last month, a group of nearly 50 signatories, including major consumer goods companies and retailers, called upon the EU to institute due diligence legislation to ensure that business avoids sourcing products associated with human rights abuses and environmental harm, such as deforestation. This recent convergence of expectations is beginning to level the playing field for businesses that use forest risk commodities. But we will not get there until these norms are reinforced by the policies of major demand-side markets. So as the EU currently considers a proposal for due diligence around deforestation and conversion-free supply chains, if the UK does similarly, this will strengthen expectations and create a strong signal for commodity producers and traders to shift business practices to safeguard natural ecosystems and their carbon and biodiversity. In contrast to the available resources and globally consistent methods that are already available for defining, monitoring, and reporting on deforestation-free supply chains, similar mechanisms do not exist for compliance with local law, which is often complex, sometimes contradictory, and changes frequently. A legality-only approach, as my colleagues have already indicated, could encourage a race to the bottom as exporting companies see a benefit in lax regulation. But even in a best scenario, this approach could result in a complex patchwork of regulatory obligations for UK companies who source forest risk commodities from dozens of jurisdictions, as many companies do. And so I think this is a happy situation where the policy approach that best meets the stated objectives could also be the one that's more simple and practical for commodity buyers to apply. This approach could be achieved by amending Schedule 16 of the draft bill to adopt a due diligence requirement, excluding commodities that are linked to recent deforestation and conversion, or to the violations of land rights of Indigenous peoples. In this way, the UK could establish its leadership in addressing environmental impacts of its commodity imports, while establishing a clear and level playing field for those affected by this regulation. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Before I come on to Nick to finish, Raoul, you got cut short by the line dropping out. Do you want to chip anything else at this point, or come back when we do questions?
Well, I just want to make the final point that, agreeing with the others that already said, we have a fear that this due diligence clause with a legally-only approach can lead to a major setback here in Brazil, and not only in Brazil, in other countries. So we can roll back our legislation just to comply with this due diligence. And we know that the UK legislation will be a trailblazer for other kind of legislations around the world. So it's very important to improve this clause. And we agree that having a zero deforestation target is something easier and can make much more stronger the environmental bill. So that's it, and I'm open for the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Raoul. Lastly, Nick Lakin, and then what I'm going to do, because she has to go early, is go to Kerry McCarthy with the first question, and then after that I'm going to ask Barry to say a couple of words, chair of the APPG, and ask a couple of questions, and I've got a couple of questions, and then we'll see how we get on.
Great, thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. So just quickly say who Kingfisher is, because you might be thinking I represent a bird charity at this point. Kingfisher is a listed FTSE 100 retailer. We own B&Q and Screwfix in this country. We're also the largest British employer in France and in Poland, and we're in a number of other European countries as well. But fundamentally, we're a DIY retailer. In the context of wood and paper is in around a quarter of all the products we use. And we've been working to protect forests for nearly 30 years as a founder member of FSC. We've got a strong commitment to help tackle climate change and to create more forest than we use. And in December last year, we announced a commitment to become forest positive by 2025. And this means three things for us. First, it's about having 100% sustainably sourced wood and paper in all the products we sell. That's because it's in a quarter of all the products that we do sell. And some of our businesses are close to that 100% target, B&Q for instance. Others, we still have some further to go, but as a group, we expect to be around 80% by the end of this year to report. Secondly, it's very relevant to this bill, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. And then thirdly, the other part of how we're becoming forest positive is we also announced we've become a founder member of Rainforest Alliance's Forest Allies Initiative. So that's really putting our money where our mouth is in restoring and supporting forests. And we think this three-pronged approach is the best way we can make a difference with a well-rounded approach. So that means we have a restorative and positive impact on forests over the long term, supporting reforestation programs, as well as sourcing forest commodities from sustainable sources that don't contribute to deforestation. Now, that second element, which is the smaller part of our business, and I think this is relevant for not just SMEs when they're thinking about the Environment Bill, but also large companies like mine, but where some of the forest products associated with forest issues is a relatively small part of our business. So let me give you the example of leather. So leather for a DIY retailer is in workwear, boots and gardening gloves, but it's about 0.5% of our total sales. So that's still quite a lot because we're quite a large company, but in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty small. And our ability to influence that kind of supply chain is also going to be quite limited. So there we're working and looking at traceability and supply chain controls to identify deforestation links. We're looking to find alternative products and obviously promoting environmental stewardship. So there we're working with organizations like the Leather Working Group, running projects looking at suppliers going back to the slaughterhouse. And the important thing to note on this is that this is a large company that's doing this at this stage in its development of how it can really tackle all elements of deforestation. Smaller businesses will have even less resources to pursue this. So the challenge is how you manage to put the right responsibility in place in the right parts of the supply chain without raising costs and limiting access to markets. So in terms of this bill, and I think I agree with a lot of what the number of the other people taking part said, you know, a risk-based approach, developing capacity over time. There are difficulties in traceability. A number of colleagues speaking from the NGO community also rightly highlight that the challenge of if you just take a legal approach alone, it isn't going to be enough. And also the principle about strong governance and also mitigating the UK's footprint over time is absolutely key. And that's the key point, that, you know, you will still be clearing forests legally in some countries, and we don't want to be incentivizing that. 4 quick thoughts to leave you with in terms of improvements for the primary legislation. And some of this is building on some of the great work that DFID has done historically with the UK government and also through EU programs. And obviously now we need to change that approach. So our 4 suggestions are around supporting projects that involve multiple commodities in forests that are under threat. So whether it's working with bodies such as the Tropical Forest Alliance, in an individual landscape, someone who does timber, there'll be another company buying cocoa and other commodities, but the projects will not all be joined up. So how can you help companies work effectively with governments and other local actors like Rainforest Alliance and certification bodies to make a difference? Second suggestion is looking at how can we build on the benefits of where the EU flagged voluntary partnership in Indonesia worked really well. This is very good at combating deforestation through multi-stakeholder work. It also costs a lot of money. The UK could work with different development agencies and do more focused programs that still make that big difference. A focused approach with a handful of high-impact initiatives would link back to that focus on the UK's impact and really driving that down. Third, supporting smallholders that are responsible for forest risk commodities. How do you incentivize that sustainable production and support those livelihoods? I think we've already talked about the RSPO Palm Trace platform, smallholder sustainable credits. You need to be really conscious about this. There's a danger that if you just say, prove you're certified or you're out, if they're small, they'll have no access, and then you're at risk of driving them into more deforestation activities as well as making local communities poorer. It's one of the reasons why we're supporting the Rainforest Alliance's Forest Allies initiative, looking at how can we help those people access markets. And then the 4th and final point is around traceability and chain of custody. So building on technology and existing legality verification and voluntary certification programs, like we focus on with FSC or PEFC for timber, identifying opportunities to do that going forward, I think will be also key. So absolutely support the mandatory call for mandatory traceability when you're sourcing at scale. For SMEs and smaller businesses or large businesses that source a small amount of certain commodities, it's how do you find a really pragmatic approach to do that effectively to drive the right outcomes. So, for example, being realistic, bulk commodities come from lots of plantations. So getting back to the individual farm or forest is really, really difficult. Hence why we rely on those certification schemes that are respected, and also we focus on how can we make those better. So like with any company, and I hope my colleague at Tesco would agree with me on this, the focus is how can we spend our money and our effort to really make a difference? And as with all legislation, having a common sense approach to do that will be key. I'll stop there and happy to discuss this further.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. Right, we'll move on to a bit of a discussion. Before I ask Barry Gardner, who chairs the APPG, to say a couple of words and ask the first question or two, Kerry McCarthy's got to go off to a committee shortly. So, Kerry, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. Apologies for having to whiz off. I'm on front bench duty in an SI over in the Palace of Westminster, and it's a bit of a trek to get there, and that's at 5. But I'm really glad that there is this focus on what we can do in the Environment Bill. I was on the Bill Committee earlier on, and then when I went on the front bench, I was taken off. But I was also on the Environmental Audit Committee when we did pre-legislative scrutiny, and the EFRA committee, and I entirely agree that just focusing on illegal deforestation, when you've got Bolsonaro, for example, legalizing things that ought to be illegal, just don't go anywhere near far enough. I'm glad that the government did bring something forward that takes us part of the way there. But when I raised it, I'm in ongoing correspondence with the Brazilian ambassador at the moment, sort of arguing the toss on some of this. But I also raised it in international trade questions the other day, looking at how we could try to factor it into negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with Brazil. And the minister came back with what sounded on the surface like quite impressive figures by how much money we've given to Brazil to combat deforestation. But of course, when you look into it, the projects that we're doing there are far outweighed by the extent of actual deforestation that's going on in other parts of the country. So I suppose that's my question is, by supporting such projects, in some ways, are we helping the government cover its tracks, or businesses cover their tracks, because, or everyone, because we can point to good things happening, but it's really just, it's not even a sticking plaster in terms of the overall damage that's being done. So how would you suggest that we approach giving aid to Brazil, supporting it through some of these climate projects, if it's not doing what we're doing already?
Raoul, do you want to start us off on that one?
Okay, thank you. Well, we have always good things and bad things happening in the country, of course, even in this government. So the government has some projects that come from other governments, and so they need to keep going on these ones. What I think could be very important for us here is not to cut the aid, but to pressure the government to stick to its legislation. So as you said, the Bolsonaro government wants to change most of our environmental legislation, mainly on forest indigenous people. We are facing here in Brazil a surge in invasion inside indigenous lands, and this is because these invaders, these land grabbers, they have expectation to be granted a land title, because the president said this during his campaign, that who else ever that goes to inside indigenous land and the forest can have a title someday. And so they are promising to change the legislation. And so that's why we fear that this due diligence clause with legality only approach can put more fire in this fire. So to stick to the legislation, to not roll back the legislation, and having a partnership with Brazil as the UK has, put you in a good place to ask for that. So I think it's better to ask responsibility than to cut the aid.
Jeff, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Right, Kerry, anything else you want to ask before you dart off?
No, I just would say I wasn't suggesting that we do cut aid. It was just whether in some ways it would give us a bit more leverage that to put pressure on the government. I just wondered how they valued what we were doing, and whether are making it conditional on them not supporting deforestation elsewhere might actually change. But if you look at I suspect if you look at the economic value to them of allowing deforestation in other places, the amount that we're giving them in terms of aid is quite small by comparison. So it's not much leverage. Yeah. But we'll carry on with my correspondence with the ambassador, though, see where we get.
Great. Barry Gardner, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you to all our speakers, and Kerry, as always, on these matters, spot on. Raoul, can I just pick you up on what you were saying about the existing legislation and it being about sticking to the existing legislation? Because many of us were very concerned by some of the Code Forestal and what came in there in terms of the ability to legitimize riparian land that had been previously accessed. So if we're going not simply for a legality approach, but for one that actually looks at the real impact of what's going on, then the existing legislation, I would have thought, is not good enough anyway, because that was brought in precisely to legitimize what was on the ground. And it then set, I can't remember what the meterage was for riparian land, you know, from the center of the river and so on. But it was in effect saying, okay, we'll now apply controls, but we'll allow everything that's already happened to be legalized. So there are fundamental flaws, are there not, with the existing legislation that we shouldn't just be glossing over here. I'm sorry to focus it simply on Brazil, but obviously that is a key focus.
Can I answer?
Sure, please.
Yeah, okay, so thank you. So you're totally right. So that's the problem here. So we opened these gates some years ago. When the farmers were demanded to comply with the legislation, they changed the legislation. And so now we have many other bills on the Congress to change not only the forest legislation, but also the protect areas legislation and the indigenous land legislation. And so you're totally right. So now we have 3 million farmers that comply with the forest code, but they were not compliant before with the old forest code. So they changed the law, and now they are legally and officially complying with the law, but they have they made nothing to get better in their production. And we have 56 other bills that want to change again the same forest code, because what happened here is that they gave an amnesty to everybody that deforested illegally before 2008. But supposedly after 2008, those that deforested illegally would be fined and would need to restore. But now we have other bills that want to do the same, because once they happened in the past, can happen again. So that's why to have a clear zero deforestation target, it's important. And we in Brazil and in Indonesia, we don't need to deforest anymore. We have enough land to produce. It's not going to be economical or a social problem here. We can do with the land already available, but we need some tools to come to this path. And this tool with the environmental bill can be one of them.
Thank you. Look, I think it's a really powerful point that once you've gone down that road, you can just keep legitimizing whatever happens on the ground, and it does descend. Debbie, you were talking about ratcheting to achieve zero deforestation by 2023. So that in some way building that into the bill, so that it's not just about legality, it is about zero deforestation. Let me ask you this. What penalties should there be, and against what should they be measured? Because good legislation is going to have to set out that structure in order then to be implemented. How do you see that?
First of all, against what it should be measured. So if there was a target, the way we see it is that obviously you would then have a cut-off point. So it'd actually be a lot within scope of this legislation. And let's not forget that not all businesses will be in scope of this legislation. There is a threshold that the government proposed. For those who are within scope, then they would be able to see from the cut-off point which land had already been deforested and converted, and that would be your baseline. And therefore, it'd be very easy, especially through mapping and other technology that we have now, to determine whether, well, I don't say easy, none of this is easy, but easier to determine your due diligence against that baseline. We have proposed that baseline should be...
Sorry, go on, yeah.
We've proposed that baseline should be 2020, but others say it should be much earlier, in line with other certification systems that are already in place. Some have said 2008. Others say 2015. So that is a debatable or an open question. In terms of enforcement, that is really, really tricky. The bill obviously suggests civil penalties, and I think within our jurisdictional approach to these kinds of things, we normally take a civil sanction approach, I would say. That is, most of our sort of frameworks, that would be the first point approach. But the bill does allow criminal sanctions as well. So I would suggest that there is a conversation around, what would warrant a criminal penalty. I have to say, having been in the past a practicing lawyer, I think criminal sanctions they have a purpose. Obviously, they have a deterrent element, but they're not always effective. So I personally, but this would be a personal view because we haven't done any serious thinking about it, would say they have to be kept for the most egregious infringements of the legislation. And then I also think that in order to apply that, we would have to have an independent body. Either we use an existing body, such as there's a body I understand who sits across timber, and Nick might know more of that, or we'd have to have the OEP, or we'd have to have a new body. And obviously, a new body is the last thing that anybody probably feels they want to try and accommodate. So
I think Nick wanted to come in on this, but maybe before he does, could I just press you as an environmental lawyer, or by background, you'll remember the debate that we had over fleg tea, which Nick referred to earlier, right at the beginning in Europe, as to whether we should go down a fleg tea route or whether we should go down a Lacey Act route. And I think many of us thought that a Lacey Act route would be preferable in that situation, precisely because it allowed for that gradation of sanction from the civil penalty right the way through to some really serious, I think maximum in Lacey Act was 10 years in prison in the US, where it's shown that there was complicity and malice aforethought, as it were. And so whilst we don't want to tie ourselves to a legalistic definition of maintaining whatever is all right in the country's laws, I think all the arguments that we've discussed show how the Lacey Act itself is flawed on that basis. But nonetheless, that gradation of sanction, I would have thought, dependent on the knowledge that a company had and their complicity with the illegality, is actually important to be able to show.
Yeah, definitely. I do think, though, that within the environmental sphere, what we've realised over the past 20 years is that civil sanctions are a way to move a company on. If you just, and I don't think you're proposing this, but if you just go down the sort of criminal sanction route, you don't necessarily improve behaviours. And therefore that conversation, and there is an element of partnership that I think is really important. And we've, I think you get improvement. That needs to be tried first, and you need a legislative framework that allows for that flexibility. But quite right, if you get to that point where you've got serious breaches from a serious infringer, there should actually be the penalty to deal with it. The problem then you have is, as you have with endangered wildlife, is whether the courts will actually impose the penalty. So there would need to, you then got that difficulty of training your judiciary to actually understand the seriousness of the crime, because you just need to look at those environmental crimes where how many have there been where there've been any real serious sanctions imposed, and they're few and far between.
So Nick, you were going to come in on that point, but also can I ask you and then Anna, how do you actually, as retailers, police this? Because if you're a superstore, how do you, for example, work out that the pork that you are buying from a producer in Northumberland actually has been fed on soy that's come from deforested areas of Brazil? And Nick, how on earth do you actually, with all the different products you deal in, identify what are the problems and what aren't? So Nick, do you want to start us?
Okay. Yeah, that's really hard work. It's about data, it's about traceability, and actually the key point of how it works for us, for our wood and paper approach, is having a very clear policy, making sure that runs through our entire business. So we say it has to be FSC certified as gold standard for wood and paper. We say PEFC, although we have some caveats there. PEFC is also a good scheme as well. Or it has to be fully recycled. So there's a clear policy, but then it's about procedures and process through your business. And we're quite a large business, and we're okay at this, and we're trying to get better. I think the thing to be really conscious to, though, is that these are large businesses having this conversation with you, and you're trying to raise the ocean for the whole country, which is the absolutely right approach. And it's also in our interest that happens. I had a couple of other thoughts to all of the conversation, and then I'll hand over to Anna. This should be about sending a strong market pull and a clear market signal, because that helps drive change. It's also about helping to fix supply chains. So we can do that as retailers, producers can do that, governments can do that, NGOs can do that. So there are a number of parties that can help do that. Restoration and compensation is something else that has to be looked at, and there's clearly a fundamental role for governments in how we address that. Capacity building, and again, a question for how governments can help in capacity building. Retailers, we're involved in capacity building, whether it's through projects we support or through direct work with our suppliers. And then I make a final comment on the policing and enforcement conversation. And I think I'm really kind of focused on what's the 80-20 principle, where you're going to have the biggest impact in this legislation to drive the greatest change. So I would do that. But on policing and enforcement, let's be honest, policing and enforcement in the UK isn't great in these kind of areas, and there's a lot more to go at. It's the same for human rights and labour regulations. We know all the scandals last year around labour supply chains in Leicester. So, you've got some companies that are really responsible and are trying their best to make a difference in this space. Legislation needs to help us raise that ocean for everybody. And then you also need to look at where can government really be most effective in making the biggest difference on this. Sorry, Anna, I'll hand over to you for the Tesco side on this.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, without wanting to repeat Nick's comments there, I think there's a huge amount of alignment from the Tesco perspective as well, in terms of the use of certification and standards, as well as policy implementation and supplier requirements as standard. I think maybe a point of difference really is about the specificity and the complexities within the individual supply chains. So if we take soy, for example, versus palm oil or something, it's hugely complex, and there are a number of factors for that. But top line, when we look at our UK livestock, for example, for certain livestock types, the feed that the animals are actually consuming is where soy is being used. It's kind of an any origin soy specification basically what that means is that that the soy could come from anywhere. And so the farmers themselves don't often know where the animal feed kind of ingredient origins lay. And so in terms of kind of quick wins, really, in addition to what we're talking about within the context of the legislation, we also have to think about how these ingredients, how these commodities come into the market. And at the point at which they come into the market, when we think about thresholds, we look at volumes, but also that point around data and transparency right the way back to point of origin. And we have to be, I think, realistic about bringing all parts of the value chain to the table. So as retailers, we sit at the end, but we're also quite visible, and that's fine. But we can't do this, and we can't deliver transformational change and achieve zero deforestation in these commodity supply chains unless we have commodity traders, unless we have the feed producers, unless we have the suppliers all lined up behind that. And we create that level of transparency and accountability that facilitates that change. And today, we don't have that dynamic within the marketplace to do that. I think it's worth just kind of reflecting on what we're seeing coming out of France at the moment with the French manifesto, kind of lines in the sand being drawn around deforestation and conversion-free cutoffs. The UK could do that, which obviously would send a strong market signal to the point that was being made before by Nick. But I think we do have to really make sure that everyone is accountable and not just kind of the most visible or biggest bits of the value chain.
Thanks, Anna. That is a very important point indeed, because it can't just be the supermarkets who get duffed up if something goes wrong. Well, like everyone, it's 2 minutes past 5 now, so we've pretty much done our hour. I think it's been a very helpful discussion. It's been very valuable. There is a lively debate to happen over this. I think that many of the points made are very valuable. I think I'd particularly like to thank Raul for joining us from Brazil, because you've given us a much more a frontline view than we might otherwise have had. But just say to all of you, I'm very grateful for you two for taking part. We've got an audience on YouTube. We're going to be circulating this recording to parliamentarians. But please keep chipping away, because this is something that matters enormously. And that everything everyone is doing will help in a very small way to change behaviours. And ultimately, it's going to be about changing behaviour right the way through the supply chain. I'm very grateful to all of you for what you've done. Satyan, thank you for organising. But otherwise, I'll let you all go on to busy evenings. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your support in this. Agree with your principle about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Chris.
Good. That's all fine. Thanks, Barry. Good luck. See you around.
Yeah. Well, in the debate tomorrow, no doubt.